Hello there. In the last video, we talked about drawing a still life from direct observation and took more of a gestural approach, whereas today we're going to be talking about things a little bit more technically, and we'll talk in more detail about how to use techniques like the Mondrian tool and perceptual grids to accurately draw objects in proportion to one another. There are a few methods for transferring your still life to paper, but since most of you are probably working from an image, I'm going to show you how to use a grid and how that can help you align everything before you begin to shade value in. Afterwards, we're going to also talk about value and chiaroscuro and a few more other techniques that will help you finish this first project. I know that some of you are already working with value and shading in your objects a little bit, which is fine. Sometimes skipping to this stage can lead to you focusing on detail early on, and you may end up wasting time because the object is too small and you have to erase your hard work. Okay, so to use a grid to help draw your composition at a larger scale, the first and most important thing is to make sure your image is proportional to the requirement assignment size. In this case, it's 9 by 11. I don't care if that's vertical or horizontal. The instructions in the images on Blackboard are slightly different than the way I do it, but they accomplish the same task. I start by printing my image and taping a piece of tracing paper over it to draw my grid on. I start by measuring where the middle of the composition is, vertically and horizontally, and then I find the halfway points between the middle line and the outside of the image. I hope the way that I'm saying this isn't confusing you too much. So as long as you apply the grid the same way to the 9.5 by 11 blank canvas, this will help you double check your shapes, sizes, proportions, and alignments of all of those objects. So here's my final drawing paper. I've already measured out the 9 by 11 space that I'll be working in. So to create the grid, I will just start by dividing 9 by 4, which is 2.25 inches. So that's how far apart my vertical lines will be. And then horizontally, 11 divided by 4 is 2.75 inches. So that's how far apart they'll be. Make sure you draw your grid lines in very lightly so that you can easily erase them when you no longer need them. Don't use red or any other color like I am. I'm just hoping the video will pick it up a little bit easier for you to see. Before I even get started, I study the image with the grid overlay to get an idea of how the objects sit in relation to each other and any angles that are made by the ribbon or shadows or other things. Using the X and Y axes to draw vertical and horizontal lines in order to make alignments in this way, these are known as Mondrian lines, after the painter who's most known for his cubist painting with the primary color palette that I'm sure you've seen before. These lines will help you compare spatial relationships as well as the heights of different objects and just overall positioning. Make sure to also use the perceptual grid that you created, in my case the red lines, in order to help you align things in the same way. Always feel free to go back and reference the image when you're confused, and feel free to draw on it for practice. If I get stuck on something, I switch my focus to another part of the composition. This is a good idea to practice. Jumping around the page at random is one of the core principles of intuitive gesture drawing, which is defined as a simultaneous overview of the wholeness of forms and their relationship in space. This grid approach is a more systematic method since I'm not drawing from direct observation, and I'm working step by step to demonstrate first the line work and then spatial transitioning. Normally during my process, I use all of these methods in combination with each other because it just helps me double check what I'm looking at. Always make sure to be flexible and continuously open to reevaluation and adjustment. Another way to double check your alignments is by looking at both the positive and negative space. We often focus on the size, shapes, and contours of the actual subject matter. What about all the spaces in between? What are the proportions of those, and how can they help you distinguish spatial relationships? For example, what are the proportions of the half heart shape the handle of the pitcher is making? Is what you've drawn correct? Ask yourself these kinds of questions as you work. A more specific example of how the grid lines can help you understand size relationships is with this first leaf that I'm drawing. Use the image with the grid to figure out exactly where the leaf belongs. In this case, exactly in the bottom right quarter of that red box. And this can also help you understand shape a little bit better. When I'm almost finished with outlining my still life, I like to go back and verify that what I've drawn correctly aligns with everything else, and if it doesn't, I can figure out which part or parts need to be moved. Don't try and squish anything that shouldn't be squished in order to make room for things. If you have to move multiple objects over, you're going to have to move multiple objects over. No taking the easy way out. For those of you still struggling with ellipses and accurately drawing objects in perspective, consider the concept of wireframing, which is otherwise known as cross-contour lines. If a string or small wire was wrapped around this jar, how would the ellipses that the string creates follow the form? If I drew straight, equidistant vertical lines on the jar, they would begin to flare out at the edges where the jar becomes larger at the top, and then they would head straight down, parallel to each other. These vertical lines would become further apart towards the center of the jar as it gets closer to us. These cross-contour lines are great for suggesting 3-dimension and how an object turns or folds. For example, the stripes in these cloths, which can help our brain understand what's going to happen when we put a light source on that object to create shadow and highlights, which is what we'll be doing next as we discuss value. When talking about value, we must discuss the Italian term chiaroscuro, which basically just means light and dark. It is the gentle transition between the full black and white spectrum that shows form and volume. It is also often referred to as shading or modeling, and I went over this a little bit in the first video, but I just wanted to talk about a couple terms in regards to shadow and light that are important for you to know. I know you guys are starting with a white piece of paper, but think about value this way. If you started out with a middle gray value for everything in your composition, what would you need to make lighter and what would you need to make darker? What reaches to the darkest end of the spectrum and what is almost white? Squinting can help you see value. If you squint at this image, the blacks will start to pop out and the whites will start to pop out and the grays will kind of go back into the distance. Chiaroscuro doesn't always have to be dark and dramatic. Take this still life, for example, and notice how the value spectrum really only spans from white to medium gray. It never goes into the dark darks. It can be beneficial to use the full value spectrum in order to show that you know how to apply those techniques. It depends on the type of mood you're creating. This very high key or light value illustration creates a completely different mood than the one I showed you before. So the overall effectiveness of the chiaroscuro drawing depends on the quality and the quantity of light illuminating your objects. If you have a direct spotlight on your still life in a dark room, the effect will be more dramatic. It's important to note that there are different kinds of light and shadow. For example, look at this round ball. This ball has a light source that's coming from this angle at the top. The highlight, which is very muted in this example. This is the lightest value that's generally found on the object, and it's created by the illumination of the light source. It can be crisp and shiny on a glass surface, or it can be fuzzy and muted on a dull surface. Then we have the light side, where the light hits the ball as well, and then we have the other half of the ball that is in shadow. But as you look carefully at the shadow, there is a lighter portion of the shadow that's known as reflected light, and this is coming from the light on the table that's reflecting back onto the object. Reflected light can also be reflected off of other objects, not only the surface that the object is sitting on. So carefully observe your objects and see if you can find the reflected light in them and try to determine where that reflected light is coming from. We also have a cast shadow. That is the shadow cast on the table from the object. Carefully observe how the value changes within the cast shadow. The darkest part is going to be right where the ball hits the table, and then it's going to get slightly lighter in value as the shadow diffuses into space. Also keep in mind how shadow changes depending on where your light source is coming from. Consider this diagram. Look at how the length of the cast shadow changes as the light source moves directly above the sphere to the side of the sphere. Also look at how the strength or darkness of the shadow changes depending on these scenarios. Again, this will be slightly different for those of you with multiple light sources. For example, room light from above in combination with sunlight coming through a window in combination with the glare of a TV. All of these things will contribute to how your still life is illuminated and how you will need to use value to show that. As I was doing at the beginning of the video in the perceptual grid demonstration, I like to bounce around the page. Don't focus on just one object at a time because you may be assuming something that you won't realize until you stare at the image for longer. Give yourself a general idea of how dark or light something should be, but always keep yourself open to adjustments. And most importantly, use your eyes and your brain. Keep double checking your work and have fun.